Hello there people, Vestin here with another Legends of Runeterra match. This time I'm playing Piltover&Zaun+Noxus with heroes Jinx and Katarina. My opponent is playing a plethora of heroes from Demacia and Freljord. He's playing Garen, Lux, Braum and Tryndamere. As much as I would love to mulligan into a 2-drop, I mostly like my opening hand. I like the Astute Academic because I want a 1-drop. I want Jinx in my hand because keeping heroes in your hand is a pretty good idea overall. And the Amateur Aeronaut has a lot going for him, considering the fact that he's elusive and thus is difficult to stop. I get the Academy Prodigy as my first draw, thus securing me a 2-drop. The 2-drop I so desperately wanted. And of course I drop the Academic onto the board because I want my turn 1 play. Not everyone can actually mulligan into 1-drops. You tend not to keep that many of them in your deck. They are somewhat inconsequential most of the time, they're usually just combo pieces. Thus the odds of someone actually countering a 1-drop with a 1-drop are somewhat slim, though not necessarily vanishingly low. As you can see, my opponent is playing the Omen Hawk. He is unlikely to be willing to trade that away, although he might just decide to do that. Sometimes dealing that initial bit of damage and avoiding that initial bit of damage yourself can be relatively meaningful, especially if you bring down an enemy minion to a single point of health. Then you can potentially use some AoE to remove it further down the line. Although, likely you are going to want to keep a chump blocker for something bigger. Thus you might want to refuse to trade it away so easily and so early on. My board presence is healthy and growing. His situation isn't terribly bad, because he buffed up 2 units of his deck with the Hawk. However, it is bad now because he just skipped his turn 2. He did not do absolutely anything. Dropping a buff 2-drop would have been quite promising. He did nothing, presumably because he couldn't do much of anything. In order to pile on as much damage as I can, as early on as I can, I decide to drop the Spider. It's fearsome, meaning it can only be blocked by units with 3 or more attack. I also drop down the Boom Kuruki, who deals 2 points of damage to the enemy nexus whenever attacking. He has that single point of attack himself, but those 2 points are an ability. The Avarosan Marksman throws a wrench into my gears by assassinating the Academy Prodigy. There is nothing I can do to save her. I still get to play the Boom Kuruki, and I am going to do so. Thus expanding my board presence up to 3 units. I have to be more careful, however. I have to be mindful of what can block and how it can block. The Spider is unlikely to get blocked by the Marksman. That would be a fairly poor trait for my opponent. So he's a lot more likely to instead deal with the Rookie, thus bringing his Marksman down to a single point of health. I could have avoided that, but I did want to deal those 2 points of damage to the Nexus, and I don't think I would have ever really gotten the opportunity to make better use of the guy. Perhaps that was a blunder on my part. I don't necessarily know. Whether to shove your units in there even though they can die and most likely will die isn't the simplest of choices. Even in these circumstances where there wasn't a ton of factors that could have mitigated damage or could have amplified the damage, etc, etc. The Kindly Tavern Keeper has somewhat mitigated the damage I've decided to pile on onto the enemy nexus. I'm going to develop Jinx onto the board to spend my mana to the best of my abilities and wait for his move. I'm obviously reluctant to block with Jinx, but I will do so if it's absolutely necessary. My opponent is taking his sweet time thinking about which units he wants to attack with, and ultimately decides to only attack with the Tavern Keeper. I make the snap call to block with Jinx, despite everything, despite the fact that this puts her down to a single point of health. He is playing Demacia and Freljord, so he's not as likely to have the sort of removal that would absolutely be lethal to her, although he of course may. For instance, Winter's Breath, I believe, deals 2 points of damage to every single creature on the board, including your own. I am, however, trying not to be extremely gun-shy with my heroes. If you refuse to ever block with them, instead taking more and more Nexus damage, you might just lose because of that. And you will not lose immediately. If you take those initial hits and then desperately scramble to avoid any further ones, you may make increasingly terrible trades later on, or you may just die at some point just because you did not avoid those few points of damage you could have otherwise avoided. Now, unfortunately, Jinx is going to die to a spell, but thankfully, because of that, she's going to take out 2 units. Not the biggest of units, it's not the best of trades, it's not a wonderful situation, but with that card, she would have gone down anyway. Had she not blocked the Tavern Keeper, she would have gotten taken out, most likely, through a single combat with the Marksman. You can play around removal by refusing to take damage on your heroes, thus trying to keep them alive, or you can play around removal by using your heroes to make as many efficient trades as you possibly can, thus when they do eventually, inevitably get taken out by some form of removal, they will have by that point made enough of a mark on the game to warrant their presence in the first place. It is round 6, and my opponent has developed Garen onto the board. That's a huge threat I am going to stun immediately and ruthlessly. I don't want that Garen striking. When Garen strikes twice, he levels up. And you don't want that happening, because then your opponent will have the attack token every single turn. Of course, I already have something up my sleeve. I have a way of disposing of Garen, but I do want to make better use of it. I want to use the Noxian Guillotine to kill damaged Garen, but I also want to kill some more things, if I possibly can. Thus this turn I've just decided to stun him. Further down the line I will damage him, and then finish him off with the spell. I am perfectly prepared to trade away my tiny worthless spiders. Especially considering the fact that this is Demacia I'm facing. Not just pure Demacia, but Demacia nonetheless. And with Demacia you really do not want to allow them to build a big board, because then they just play for Demacia and kill you. Round 7 arrives. And with it I draw a Jury Rig, which I am not about to play. That's for surprise blocks. I am, therefore, going to shovel in and see what he does. Presumably he's going to block one of my attackers, which means Garen's going to strike a single time. I have the option of using Noxian Guillotine afterwards. I can do that. Do I necessarily want to do that, though? I'm not entirely convinced. You get to recast Noxian Guillotine, and preferably I would really like to do so. Garen is a big threat, but he is not the only big threat, is he? My opponent is considering his options and decides to play the Alpha Wildclaw, an enormous minion, which makes my decision all the easier. I could kill Garen right here, right now, but I think I'd rather also kill the Wildclaw alongside him. Garen has struck a single time. He needs to strike another time to level up. He will level up then, yes, but he will still remain injured. Turn 8 comes and my opponent just attacks with everything he's got, with Garen and the Wildclaw. I'm going to block both of them, take some damage to the face, thanks to the Wildclaw's Overwhelm. And then I'm going to execute both of them, and play the Sum Dredger, discarding Jury Rig. My opponent is yet again pondering his options. But not for too long of a time. He ultimately does decide to just let things be. Garen attacks, levels up, so does the Wildclaw. 14 hit points on my Nexus. And I get to use the Noxian Guillotine. I probably should play the Sum Dredger first, just to test out the waters. But if there's a possibility of him healing up Garen and the Wildclaw, then perhaps it's for the best to play it right off the bat. Yes, if he has a burst or fast spell, then that doesn't really matter. That doesn't make things any better, because spells resolve from the newest one to the oldest one on the stack. But if it was, say, a healing minion or a slow spell, then it would have been a completely different situation. Although I don't know off the top of my head of any slow spells that could possibly do that, and the only minion that comes to mind is the Tavern Keeper. Still, He played the Larong Blade Keeper, buffing the Wild Claw. Which is brilliant, but also fairly naive. He knows I have the Guillotine, he knows the Wild Claw is going to die. So buffing the Wild Claw was entirely pointless. He had something else to play, so he didn't just play the guy to have the guy. He could have played the 3-3 and then buffed that. I wouldn't have been able to use the Guillotine on that minion, since he's fresh and new, uninjured. Why he decided to buff the Wild Claw, I have no clue. But hey, people do make mistakes from time to time. I do get to play Jinx. And she immediately levels up because my hand is empty now. Excellent, I have the attack token, she can deal 5 points of damage, has quick attack. I also have a 2 attacking guy who's elusive. And of course the fall 3 that can be blocked by a 3-3. But ultimately, my opponent would prefer not to have to do that, since he has For Demacia and thus desires to buff his units while attacking. But alas, he has to use For Demacia now, so that trade does not become a necessity. But as such, instead of attacking with everything so that he can conveniently block and say kill Jinx, I decide to just block with the elusive unit, thus wasting his For Demacia.
Uncle, it is good to see.
Yes, nepotism, literally, we know. Mystic Shot might just come in handy if he decides to buff his units at the last second, which he just might. Professor Von Yip has his place in my deck, definitely, and I am going to end up playing him. He's just not particularly useful.
Perhaps we should pause for thought.
He's not particularly useful at the moment, although he is adorable. My opponent is trying to decide who to hook with the Larong Protégé. Now of course I can mitigate the most damage from Tryndamere using Jinx, that is true. However, I wouldn't necessarily want to do that. I don't want Jinx to die. So her being hooked essentially takes it out of my hands. I have no option of suiciding Jinx now, which is great. I will chump block the 3-3. Von Yip is going to block the 2-3, not killing it. The Sump Dredger is going to kill Tryndamere, at least his initial form anyway. And I'm going to take a lot of face damage. That much, however, is fairly unavoidable. Fortunately, I did make the initial decision I did decide to make. I avoided initial unnecessary damage. And this has put me in a spot where I can survive that decent bit of damage I'm going to take to my face. One trade.
I'm not done.
Having dealt 5 points of overwhelm damage to my face, Tryndamere, predictably enough, comes back. But other than that, I'm in a reasonable spot. I can use the Super Mega Death Rocket to deal 4 points of damage to the enemy's Nexus, and 1 point of damage to every single ally my opponent has. Lightly bruising Tryndamere and killing his other minion. Ah yes, Avalanche, that's what the spell is called. That's the one that deals 2 points of damage and kills my beloved Jinx. Well then, I'm only left with my lovely elusive minion at a single hit point, but thankfully I draw the used cask salesman, who of course summons his casks. As you can see, that's 4 points of damage, 2 from the elusive aeronaut and 2 from the exploding casks. Brings me down to 7 health and him down to a single hit point. However, that doesn't really help me all that much, now does it? Yes, I am going to bring him down to a single hit point, but as soon as the next turn comes, he's just going to attack with Tryndamere. I am going to block him, and the overwhelm damage is going to kill me right off the bat. I really desperately need something to save me here. Redoubled Valor, as you may know, heals to full, then doubles attack and defense, meaning Tryndamere is now an 18-18 unit. Thankfully, I draw Blade's Edge, and thus somehow manage to eke out a win despite everything, despite Tryndamere being an 18-18 champion. My opponent has a tough time accepting this, but eventually gives up and surrenders. I managed to eke out this win. Thanks for watching, and you will see me elsewhere.